In the chilly silence of a winter morning, a little girl covered in bruises slumped on the porch and whispered with trembling lips, "Please, don't tell her I'm here." The wealthy man who found her had spent years hiding from the world, but what he did next would change both their lives forever. Ashford, Vermont had a way of disappearing under snow. Not beautifully, not gently, but completely. On that winter morning, the sky hung low and colorless, pressing down over the neighborhood like a lid. Snow drifted across the quiet street in slow, steady sheets, softening rooftops, swallowing sidewalks, muting every sound that might have reminded the world it was still alive. Elias Thorne walked the same route he had walked every morning for nearly 3 years. Same heavy coat, same leather gloves, same measured pace, same silence. Beside him, Milo, his aging golden retriever, padded through the slush with calm devotion, nose low, leash loose between them. Elias preferred it this way. Predictable, controlled. Routine asked nothing of him. Routine did not reopen graves. At the end of the lane, Elias's house stood behind him like a monument of glass and steel, elegant and cold, too large for one man and too empty for comfort. He never looked back at it for long. Then Milo stopped. Not hesitated. Stopped. The dog's body stiffened, ears lifting toward an older porch 2 houses down, half buried beneath a fringe of snow. Elias followed the line of his gaze with mild annoyance, at first expecting a fallen decoration, a torn trash bag, some harmless suburban mess. Instead, he saw a small shape curled against the porch railing. A child. She sat tucked into the corner behind a flower pot, dusted white, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Snow had gathered on the shoulders of her thin gray hoodie. One of her bare legs was streaked pink from the cold. Her face was half hidden, but even from the sidewalk, Elias could see the bruise blooming around one eye. He should have kept walking. He told himself that. Then the little girl lifted her head, lips blue, voice brittle as frozen glass. "Please, don't tell her I'm here." And just like that, the morning changed. The words did not sound like a child's words. They sounded older, worn down, used too many times. Elias slowed, then stepped onto the neighboring walkway, boots crunching softly through the snow. He stopped several feet from the porch and crouched, careful not to come too close. Milo sat beside him, alert but quiet, his warm body a silent promise that no sudden harm would come from this direction. "Hey," Elias said, lowering his voice without thinking. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl pressed herself harder against the railing. Her whole body had the look of something cornered too often. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her hair, once probably light brown, hung in damp tangles around her face. Her lips trembled from the cold, but her eyes, wide, watchful, dark with caution, were what stopped him cold. That was not the look of a lost child. That was the look of a hunted one. "My name's Elias," he said gently. "What's yours?" Her eyes flicked toward the front door, then toward the driveway, then back to him. Finally, barely above a whisper, she said, "Lila. That's a nice name." She didn't answer. "Do you live here, Lila?" A pause. Then one small nod. Elias glanced at the house. No lights, no movement, no sign that any adult inside even knew or cared that a child sat outside freezing. "Where are your parents?" he asked. The question changed her face at once. Her jaw tightened. She looked down at the snow near her shoes. "I live with my aunt," she murmured. He studied her for a moment. The thin hoodie. No gloves, no hat. Bare knees mottled from the cold. A fading bruise near her temple. She hugged herself tighter and whispered the words that twisted something hard inside his chest. "I just got locked out." Then after the smallest pause, "It's okay. I know how to wait." Elias felt the winter air turn sharper in his lungs. No child should know how to say that. For a few seconds, Elias said nothing. He only looked at her, at the way she kept her shoulders raised as if bracing for impact, at the way her gaze kept darting toward the driveway instead of the street, as if the real danger was not the cold, but whoever might return through it. He slipped one gloved hand into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Lila saw it instantly. Fear exploded across her face. No, she gasped, lunging forward so suddenly she nearly lost the blanket of snow gathered around her legs. Her fingers clutched the sleeve of his coat with shocking force for such a small child. Please don't call them. Please don't call the police. Elias froze, phone still in his hand. It's okay, he said carefully. They can help you. Her breathing turned fast and uneven. She shook her head so hard wet strands of hair stuck to her cheeks. No. No, they can't. The words came out cracked, desperate, tumbling over each other. Last time they came, my aunt cried and told them I fall a lot. She told them I make things up when I'm angry. And when they left, Lila's voice broke. She swallowed hard, but the rest forced its way out anyway. She beat me worse. She said if I ever made her look bad again, she'd make sure they took me away forever. Elias slowly lowered the phone. The silence between them deepened. Now he understood. This was worse than fear of punishment. This was fear of rescue failing. Fear trained into her until the cold porch had become safer than being saved the wrong way. Lila let go of his sleeve, but only barely. Her hand still trembled. Please, she whispered again, smaller now. Don't make it worse. Elias looked at her bruised face, her frozen knees, the terror shaking through her tiny frame, and felt something old and buried begin to crack open inside him. He put the phone away. Okay, he said softly. I hear you. And for the first time in years, Elias Thorne stopped being a man merely passing by. He became a man who stayed. Lila would not leave the porch, Elias asked gently, then more gently. He pointed through the falling snow toward his house at the end of the lane, all glass and dark stone and silent windows. I live right there, he said, just for a few minutes. You can warm up and come back before anyone notices. Lila's whole body tightened. No. The answer came fast, too fast. If I'm not here when she gets back, she'll be mad. She said it the way a person might speak about gravity. Not anger, not fear. Certainty. Elias exhaled slowly, white breath folding into the winter air. All right, he said. Then we do it your way. That made her look at him, a real look this time. Brief, suspicious, almost disbelieving. You stay where you feel safest, he said. I'll bring the warmth to you. Her eyes searched his face as if checking for the trap hidden beneath the offer. When she found none, she gave the smallest nod. Elias rose and walked back through the snow, every instinct in him pulling in opposite directions. He should have called immediately. He should have forced the issue. He should have done something bigger, louder, more official. But another part of him, the part shaped by grief, by regret, by the memory of getting there too late, knew panic could ruin everything. A frightened child did not need force. She needed proof. Inside his house, the silence hit him like a wall. It was always silent. But now it felt unnatural, shameful. He moved quickly through the kitchen, hands unsteady for reasons he did not want to examine. He filled a thermos with hot chocolate he had made that morning, out of habit more than desire. He grabbed the thickest wool blanket he could find from the linen closet. Then he paused in the hallway outside a door he rarely opened. The guest room closet. No, not a guest room. His daughter's room. Even after 3 years, the house still remembered better than he allowed himself to. Elias stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and lavender sealed away time. He stared at a small knit cap tucked into a storage basket on the shelf, deep, plum, soft, hand-woven, barely worn. Ivy had hated hats, said they flattened her curls. His throat tightened so suddenly he had to grip the doorframe. For one terrible second, he almost left it there, Then he took it. When he returned, Lila had not moved. Snow had gathered along the slope of her shoulders and in the tangled strands of her hair. She looked smaller than before, as if the cold had been steadily shrinking her into the wood. "It's me," Elias said softly before stepping onto the porch. She flinched anyway. He crouched down, moving with care, and draped the wool blanket around her narrow shoulders. She stiffened at the first touch, every muscle ready to recoil. But when the warmth settled over her, something inside her seemed to falter. Not trust. Not yet. But resistance. He handed her the thermos. Her fingers fumbled against the lid, too numb to grip it properly, so he unscrewed it for her and placed it carefully in her hands. Lila took one cautious sip, then another, her eyes closed. Just for a second. When she opened them again, they were shining. "I'll give it back," she whispered. "I don't want to owe you." The words went through him like broken glass. Elias looked at her for a long moment, then gently set the knit hat beside her. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "Not for being cold." And somewhere beneath the snow, beneath the silence, beneath the ache, he had spent years trying not to feel something began to thaw. Elias sat on the frozen porch steps beside Lila, though not too close. Close enough to stay. Far enough not to frighten her. Milo lowered himself between them with the solemn grace of an old guardian, his golden fur already dusted with snow, his dark eyes tracking every shift in the street. Lila glanced at him once uncertain, then reached out one trembling hand. Milo leaned into her fingers without hesitation. That was the first time Elias saw something other than fear move across her face. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. As the minutes passed, the world narrowed to little things. The soft hiss of snowfall. Lila's uneven breathing. The distant groan of a passing truck somewhere beyond the neighborhood. The way she held the thermos with both hands, as if warmth itself were something that might be taken back if she didn't protect it. Elias asked simple questions. He kept his voice low, unthreatening. "What grade are you in second? Do you like school?" A shrug. "What do you like?" That took longer. Finally, she said, "Dogs." It was barely more than air, but it was honest. Elias almost smiled. Milo's flattered. Lila looked at the dog again, and for one fragile instant her mouth moved like she had almost forgotten how to make a smile. Then a car door slammed somewhere down the block. The reaction was immediate. Her shoulders snapped upward. The thermos nearly slipped from her hands. She curled inward so fast it was like watching a body remember pain before the mind could think. Elias felt something cold and violent move through his chest. That posture, that instinctive folding in. He had seen it before. Not here, not like this. But years ago in another house during summer storms when thunder used to split the sky wide open. Ivy, 8 years old, small and bright, and so alive, it had once felt impossible that the world could ever go dark around her, used to tuck herself into the hallway corner with her knees against her chest whenever the lightning got too loud. She would count under her breath. 1, 2, 3. Waiting for the next crack of thunder to prove she had survived the last one. Elias had always sat with her. Always. Until the day he couldn't. The memory came hard and sharp, uninvited. Ivy's scraped knees. Her loud laugh. The gap in her front teeth she had hated and he had adored. His wife Mara calling from the kitchen. Summer light. The illusion that love could keep a life intact. Then sirens. Then glass. Then nothing he could ever fix. Elias stared at Lila, at the bruised eye she kept trying to turn away, at the tiny body trained to expect harm, and grief rose in him with terrifying force. But this time it didn't hollow him. It moved him. That was the difference. He was not sitting beside memory. He was sitting beside need. Lila took another small sip of hot chocolate and whispered almost apologetically, "I'm not usually trouble." Elias swallowed against the ache in his throat. "I know," he said. And he did. No child apologized that carefully, unless someone had taught her existence was expensive. Snow gathered on the porch rail. Milo laid his head across Lila's shoe, and for the first time since burying his family, Elias felt his grief shift from something dead and sealed into something dangerous and alive. Not because it hurt, because it finally had somewhere to go. The cold deepened as the morning wore on. Lila stayed wrapped in the blanket, shoulders hunched, chin tucked down, as if she had learned long ago that making herself smaller improved her odds of surviving a bad day. Elias rose once to fetch another pair of gloves from his house, and when he came back, he noticed something he had missed before. A backpack. It sat half-collapsed near the porch steps, soaked through and darkened by melted snow. One strap had been repaired with strips of silver duct tape wrapped so many times it looked more like a wound than a fix. The zipper hung crooked. The side pocket gaped open just enough for a folded piece of paper to show. Elias did not reach for it, but he saw enough. School letterhead, bold black print. The words, "Attendance concerns." His jaw tightened. When he looked back at Lila, she had seen where his eyes went. Instantly, she dragged the bag closer with the toe of her shoe. Not protective, exactly ashamed. As if even the condition of her backpack might be one more thing she could be blamed for. "It's old," she murmured. Elias crouched again. "That's not your fault." She didn't answer. Then something else caught his attention. Her wrist. A faded plastic hospital band sat loose against her skin, the white strip softened by wear, the ink on it smudged and ghosting away. The edges had rubbed her raw in places. It was not from yesterday, maybe not even last week. It had the look of something forgotten by everyone except the child still wearing it. Elias nodded toward it gently. "Does that hurt?" Lila glanced down and immediately tucked her hand beneath the blanket. "No. Did a doctor give it to you?" She hesitated. That alone was answer enough. Then she said in the plain, practical tone children use when speaking about the unacceptable as if it were ordinary, "They keep it on so they remember me." The porch seemed to tilt beneath him. He looked at her more closely now, not just the bruise, not just the split in her lower lip, but the layered signs. A faint yellowing mark near the collarbone. A healing scrape along her knuckles. The stiffness in the way she shifted one shoulder like one side of her body had learned to carry pain more quietly than the other. This was not one bad night. Not one outburst. Not one accident. This was a private war being fought against a child too small to defend herself. Across the street, curtains moved. Someone was watching. Elias turned and saw the subtle motion of fabric in the front window of the blue house opposite. A figure stood there for the briefest second before disappearing back behind the lace curtain. A witness, maybe more than one. He looked down the block. Trim porches, clean cars, holiday wreaths still hanging though Christmas had long passed. A nice street, respectable, quiet. The kind of place people used to describe as safe because the lawns were neat and the suffering stayed indoors. Lila shifted under the blanket and dabbed at her mouth with the sleeve of her hoodie. When her arm lowered, Elias saw it. A fresh line of blood. Not much, just enough. His pulse sharpened. "Lila," he said softly, "what happened to your lip?" She gave him the same answer every wounded child gives when the truth has become dangerous. "Nothing." Then, almost immediately, "Please don't make trouble." Elias stared at the blood on her sleeve, the hospital band on her wrist, the school notice in her ruined bag, and understood with chilling clarity that this porch was not the beginning of her story. It was merely the first part anyone had bothered to see. Elias stood slowly. Across the street, the curtain moved again. He pretended not to notice at first, watching the quiet neighborhood the way a stranger might. The snow kept falling soft and relentless, coating the tidy lawns and carefully shoveled walkways in a clean white lie. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Elias turned back toward Lila. "I'll be right back," he said quietly. Her head snapped up. Panic flashed across her face again. "Don't leave." The words were small, but they hit him like a weight. "I'm not leaving," he said immediately. "I'll still be right here." He pointed to the house across the street. "Just there. I can see you the whole time." Lila watched him with the careful attention of someone who had learned that promises were often temporary things. Finally, she nodded once, gripping the thermos tighter. Elias crossed the street. The snow crunched beneath his boots. The blue house looked ordinary, white trim, hanging fern basket frozen stiff with winter, a wind chime clinking faintly in the cold air. Before he even knocked, the door opened a crack. A woman in her late 60s stood behind it. Silver hair, heavy sweater, eyes that already looked guilty. "You saw her?" she said softly. Elias nodded. "Yes." The woman sighed and opened the door a little wider. "Her name's Lila," she said. "Lives next door with her aunt, Vanessa." She said the name carefully, like it carried history. "Do you know what's going on?" Elias asked. The woman's shoulders sagged. "My name is Mrs. Alvarez," she said. "And yes, I know enough." Elias felt tension coil in his chest. Enough, how Mrs. Alvarez glanced across the street toward the porch before answering. "I hear shouting sometimes," she said quietly. "Late at night, sometimes things breaking. Once." I heard her crying for a long time. Elias's jaw tightened. "Did you call someone?" "Yes," the answer came quickly. "Months ago. I called Child Protective Services. Someone came to the house. Vanessa made coffee, smiled, said Lila was clumsy and always falling. Mrs. Alvarez swallowed. They left." The silence stretched. "What happened after?" Elias asked. The woman's eyes filled. The bruises got worse. She looked down at her hands. "Lila stopped waving to me after that. Stopped talking when I walked by." Outside, the wind rattled a loose gutter somewhere down the street. Mrs. Alvarez whispered the hardest truth of all. "People on this street have heard things for a long time." Elias followed her gaze back toward the porch, where a small child sat wrapped in a blanket trying to disappear. "But nobody wanted to be wrong," she finished quietly. Elias stepped back toward the door. "No," he said. His voice had changed. People just didn't want to be involved. When Elias returned to the porch, Lila was still there. Exactly where he had left her. Exactly how she had been sitting. That alone told him everything he needed to know about the rules of her life. She had not shifted an inch. The blanket hung around her shoulders, but the snow had already begun settling along the edges again. Milo sat beside her like a silent sentinel, tail curled neatly around his paws. When she saw Elias, something eased in her face. Just a little. But then she noticed where he had come from. Her eyes darted toward Mrs. Alvarez's house. "You told her?" she asked quickly. "No," Elias said. "We just talked." Lila nodded, but the tension didn't fully leave her shoulders. Elias crouched beside the porch step again. Milo leaned gently against Lila's leg, offering warmth without asking permission. For a few moments, no one spoke. Then Elias noticed something strange. Lila kept wiping her mouth with the sleeve of her hoodie. Not nervously, carefully. Too carefully. "Lila," he said softly. "Look at me for a second." She hesitated, then slowly lifted her chin. That was when he saw it. A thin red line along the corner of her lip. Not a scrape, a split. Fresh, just beginning to clot in the freezing air. Before he could speak, Lila wiped the sleeve across it again. The fabric came away stained. Just a small smear of blood. But enough. "Did someone hit you?" Elias asked quietly. Her reaction was immediate. "No, too fast, too practiced. I just fall a lot." She looked down at the thermos again, as if hoping the conversation might end there. Elias didn't push, but he didn't look away either. The silence stretched long enough for Lila to feel it. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Then she whispered the words that had clearly ruled her life for years. "Please don't make trouble." The sentence landed with quiet devastation. Across the street, a curtain moved again. Another neighbor watching, another witness, another person deciding how much involvement their conscience required. Eliada's gaze returned to the blood on her sleeve, then to the hospital bracelet, then to the school paper in her bag, then back to the bruised eye she kept turning away from him. A pattern, a system, a child trapped inside both. He reached slowly into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. Lila saw it. Her breathing immediately changed. "Please," she whispered. Elias closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. "I'm going to help you," he said. Even if the world had already failed her once, the sound came before the car. A low, vibrating thump, bass, out of place against the quiet snowfall. Elias felt it in his chest before the headlights turned the corner. Lila heard it too. Her entire body locked. The thermos slipped slightly in her hands. Her shoulders rose toward her ears, her eyes fixed on the end of the street with the terrified focus of prey spotting a returning predator. "No," she whispered. The car slid into the driveway beside the house behind her. An old sedan, paint faded, rear bumper hanging slightly crooked. Music blasted for another second after the engine died before someone inside laughed and shut it off. Two men climbed out first. They stumbled slightly on the icy pavement, their voices loud and sloppy. Even from across the yard, Elias could smell the sour mix of cigarette smoke and cheap alcohol drifting through the cold air. Then the passenger door opened. A woman stepped out, mid-30s. Too much makeup smeared beneath tired eyes, cheap faux fur coat thrown over a glittering top meant for somewhere louder than this quiet street. Vanessa Cade. She slammed the car door and fumbled with her keys, already irritated before she even looked up. Then she saw the porch, saw Lila. Her face hardened instantly. "What the hell do you think you're doing out here?" she shouted. The words sliced through the street like breaking glass. Lila shrank backward so fast the blanket slipped off one shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just waiting." Vanessa climbed the porch steps in 3 angry strides. "I told you not to sit where people could see you." She grabbed Lila's arm, hard. The cry that escaped the little girl wasn't loud, but it was raw. Elias felt it like electricity in his spine. Vanessa shook her once. "You trying to embarrass me now?" she hissed. The motion pulled Lila's sleeve up. That was when Elias saw it. Dark marks along her arm. Not one bruise. Several. Different shades. Different ages. Layered. Belt marks. Across the street, a curtain shifted again. Mrs. Alvarez stood frozen on her porch phone and her hand thumb hovering, but not moving. The 2 men by the car suddenly looked uncomfortable. One stared at the ground. The other pretended to check his phone. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Vanessa leaned close to Lila's ear and whispered something vicious. "Nobody cares about you." That was when Lila broke. Not quietly. Not politely. Her voice ripped out of her chest in a sob that seemed years old. "I can't take her beatings anymore." The words echoed across the snow-covered street. For one suspended second, the world held its breath, and Elias Thorne finally moved. Elias didn't remember deciding to move. One second he stood at the edge of the sidewalk, fists tight at his sides. The next he was already crossing the street. Snow crunched sharply under his boots as he stepped onto the driveway. His pulse pounded against his ribs like something trying to escape. For half a heartbeat, the old fear returned, the fear that acting could make things worse. But then Vanessa jerked Lila's arm again. and the fear burned away. "Hey!" Elias's voice cut across the porch like a blade. Vanessa spun around. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the neighbor," Elias said calmly. He climbed the steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood between Vanessa and the little girl. Not aggressive, not loud, just immovable. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "This is none of your damn business." Behind him, Lila's small fingers clutched the back of his coat like a lifeline. Elias kept his voice steady. "She's freezing. She's dramatic," Vanessa snapped. "Kid lies all the time." Elias didn't argue. He just looked down at Lila's arm where the sleeve had slipped back, at the bruises, at the dark lines running across pale skin. Then he looked back up. "You need to let go of her." Vanessa laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You think you know anything about raising a kid?" she sneered. "This is my house, my niece. I can discipline her however I want." Behind Elias, Lila suddenly sobbed. Not quietly. The words burst out of her in a shaking cry that seemed pulled from somewhere deep inside her ribs. "I can't take her beatings anymore." The entire street fell silent. Even the two men by the car stopped moving. Vanessa froze for a second. Just long enough. Elias stepped forward and gently pulled Lila behind him. "You heard her," he said quietly. Vanessa's face twisted with fury. "She's lying. Then the police can sort it out." Vanessa's expression changed instantly. Fear flickered, for the first time since she arrived. "You call the cops and you'll regret it," she hissed. Elias didn't answer. He had already dialed. The sirens arrived faster than Elias expected. At first they were faint somewhere far down the main road, then louder, closer, until the sound rolled through the quiet neighborhood like thunder. Vanessa's confidence cracked. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" she snapped, backing away slightly. Elias didn't respond. He was already kneeling beside Lila again, pulling the blanket back around her shoulders. Her entire body shook, whether from cold or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. "You're okay," he murmured. "I'm right here." The first patrol car slid into the street seconds later, tires crunching through snow. Red and blue lights exploded across the quiet houses, reflecting off the frozen road and the white porch railing. An officer stepped out, young, alert. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, the shouting woman, the two uneasy men by the car, the small girl wrapped in a blanket, and the man kneeling beside her. The bruises made the officer's expression change immediately. "What's going on here?" he asked. Vanessa answered first. "This guy's harassing me. My niece slipped outside and he started making accusations." The officer didn't reply right away. He walked toward Lila slowly. "Hey there," he said gently. "What's your name?" Lila didn't speak. Her hand tightened in the fabric of Elias's coat. Elias spoke quietly. "Her name is Lila." The officer crouched slightly to see her face. He noticed the split lip, the swollen eye, the shaking hands. Then he looked at Vanessa. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step off the porch." Vanessa's voice rose immediately. "This is ridiculous now." Another police car arrived behind the first, then an ambulance. Neighbors began appearing in doorways drawn by the flashing lights. Vanessa kept shouting as officers led her down the steps, still blaming everyone else. But Lila barely noticed. She clung to Elias, trembling. "They're going to take me away," she whispered. The words were filled with a quiet terror far deeper than the cold. "They'll send me somewhere else." Elias looked down at her, at the child who had spent the entire morning trying not to be seen. He placed a steady hand around her shoulders. "Not without me," he said. The ambulance doors closed with a hollow metallic thud. Inside, the light was harsh and white. Too bright, too clinical, too different from the gray quiet of the snow-covered street. Lila sat rigid on the narrow bench seat, the wool blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. A paramedic gently checked her pulse while another examined the split in her lip. Elias stood just outside the open door, unsure whether he should climb inside. Lila solved the question herself. She lifted her hand slowly and pressed it against the fogging glass. Waiting. Elias tapped the window once. "I'm right behind you," he said. The ambulance pulled away moments later. The emergency department at St. Vincent Medical Center smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. Machines beeped steadily in the distance, a constant mechanical rhythm that made everything feel colder. A nurse guided Lila into an examination room. Elias waited in the hallway, hands in his pockets, back against the wall. For several minutes, the only sound was the quiet shuffle of hospital staff passing by. Then a nurse opened the door. "She keeps looking for you," the woman said. Elias stepped inside. Lila sat on the edge of the hospital bed, legs swinging slightly above the floor. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, like she had been taught not to take up too much space. The doctor examined her carefully. "I'm going to check your lip," she said gently. "Tell me if it hurts." Lila nodded, but when the doctor touched her cheek, her shoulders flinched automatically, even though the touch was soft, even though it didn't hurt. Elias noticed. So did the doctor. Later in the hallway, the doctor spoke quietly. "She has older injuries," she said, "bruising in different stages of healing. We'll document everything." Elias nodded slowly. "What happens now?" Before the doctor could answer, another voice spoke behind him. "That depends." Elias turned. A woman in her early 40s stood there with a leather satchel and tired eyes. Nora Bell, Child Protective Services. Her gaze shifted toward the exam room where Lila sat silently on the bed. "She'll need somewhere safe tonight." And suddenly Elias understood something terrifying. Saving Lila from the porch was only the beginning. The hospital hallway had grown quieter. Night had begun to settle outside the tall windows, turning the snow into a pale blue glow beneath the streetlights. Inside the small consultation room, Lila sat in a chair far too big for her, the wool blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Across from her, Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lila asked a question that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the room. "Are they going to send me somewhere far away?" Elias chose his words carefully. "They're trying to keep you safe." She nodded slowly, but the look in her eyes said she had heard that promise before. After a moment, she whispered almost apologetically, "I'll be good wherever they send me." The sentence struck Elias harder than anything else that had happened that day. He stared at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "I had a daughter," he said quietly. Lila looked up. Her name was Ivy. The name hung in the air like fragile glass. "She was 8, Elias continued. "She used to hide in the hallway during thunderstorms and make me sit with her until the lightning stopped." His voice stayed steady, but only barely. "She and my wife died 3 years ago. Car accident." Lila didn't interrupt. She only listened. Elias finally met her eyes. "I spent a long time pretending the world didn't need me anymore," he said. Silence settled between them again. Then Lila reached out and placed 2 small fingers gently on Milo's head as the dog lay beside the chair. "You didn't leave me," she said softly. Elias felt something inside his chest shift. "No," he answered. "I didn't." An hour later, Nora Bell returned with a stack of forms and a tired expression. "I've made some calls," she said, taking a seat across from Elias. "But emergency placements are limited tonight. The shelters are full and foster availability is thin this late." Lila listened quietly, eyes fixed on the floor. Nora continued gently. "We may have to move her to a temporary intake facility for a few days until something opens up." Lila's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She just lowered her head slightly, the way someone might accept bad weather, Elias felt the decision form before he consciously thought it through. Then send her with me. Nora blinked. I'm sorry, temporary placement, Elias said. Emergency guardianship. Whatever process you need. Nora studied him carefully. You're not family, she said. And you understand that situations like this involve background checks, home inspections, legal oversight. Run them, Elias said calmly. Lila's head slowly lifted. Nora glanced between them. Mr. Thorne, this isn't a short-term favor. If you step into this, it becomes complicated. Elias didn't hesitate. She's not going back there, he said, and she's not disappearing into a waiting list tonight. Silence filled the room. Lila's eyes moved between them, uncertain, cautious. Finally, Nora sighed. I can start the emergency placement process, she said. Elias nodded once. For the first time that day, Lila looked directly at him. Not with fear, but with something much more fragile. By the time the paperwork cleared, the sky outside had turned pale gray again. Morning. Lila rode in the back seat of Elias's car, wrapped in the same blanket from the porch. Milo sat beside her, his large head resting calmly on her knee. The drive through Ashford was quiet. Streetlights flickered off one by one as dawn slowly climbed into the sky. After a few minutes, Lila leaned forward slightly between the seats. I won't be loud, she said. Elias glanced at her through the rearview mirror. What do you mean I won't make messes? She added quickly. I'll stay out of the way. The words were spoken with careful seriousness, as if she had rehearsed them before. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. You're allowed to be loud, he said gently, and you're allowed to make messes. Lila looked unsure about that. When they reached the house, she stepped out of the car, slowly staring up at the tall glass windows and stone walls, as if the place might reject her. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them immediately. Elias showed her the kitchen first, then the living room, then where Milo slept. Lila placed her battered backpack carefully beside the couch like something valuable. When Elias handed her a mug of warm milk, she held it with both hands, just like the thermos earlier. You can sleep here tonight, he said, spreading a blanket across the couch. She nodded. Within minutes, her eyes began to close. But just before sleep took her, she reached out and lightly grabbed his sleeve. You're staying, Elias pulled a chair closer. I'm right here. And for the first time in a very long time, the house didn't feel empty. The calm did not last. By mid-morning the next day, the system began to move. Nora Bell arrived at Elias's house with 2 thick folders and a careful expression. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the world quiet and deceptively peaceful. Inside the kitchen, Lila sat at the table feeding Milo small pieces of toast. She looked up nervously when Nora entered. Good morning, Lila, Nora said gently. Lila nodded, then returned her attention to the dog. Elias stepped into the hallway with Nora. This part won't be easy, she said quietly. I didn't expect it to be. Nora opened one of the folders. Vanessa Cade has already contacted a public defender. She's claiming you interfered and manipulated the situation. Elias's expression didn't change. Let her. Nora studied him. You understand this could become public? You're not an anonymous neighbor, Mr. Thorne. People know who you are. He nodded once. Elias Thorne had built half the modern skyline in Ashford. His projects had headlines attached to them. Now something else might. Background checks will start today, Nora continued. Home inspections, psychological evaluation, financial review. That's fine. You may also face media attention. Elias glanced into the kitchen. Lila was whispering something to Milo and giggling quietly when the dog licked crumbs from her fingers. That sound laughter felt fragile and rare. He turned back to Nora. Do whatever you need to, he said. But she's not going back there. Nora closed the folder slowly. For the first time since she arrived, she smiled. Good, she said. because this might turn into a fight. 2 days later, the courtroom smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The hearing was small, but tense. Vanessa Cade sat at the opposite table beside her lawyer, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her glare never left Elias. Lila sat beside Nora, small feet dangling from the chair, Milo's leash wrapped nervously around her hand. Judge Raymond Holloway adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file. Let's begin. The testimony unfolded slowly. Mrs. Alvarez spoke first. Her voice trembled as she described the shouting she had heard through the walls at night, the crying, the bruises. Then the hospital report was read. Multiple injuries, different stages of healing, inconsistent with accidental falls. Vanessa's lawyer tried to argue exaggeration, but the evidence spoke quietly for itself. Finally, the judge turned toward Elias. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "you are not related to this child. Why should the court consider placing her in your care?" The room grew still. Elias stood. He could have talked about his resources, his home, his influence. Instead, he told the truth. "I found her sitting in the snow," he said. He described the porch, the whisper, the fear in her eyes when he mentioned the police. He paused before finishing. "When a child says they can't take the pain anymore," Elias said quietly, "someone has to listen." Judge Holloway studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Temporary guardianship is granted pending review." Lila's grip tightened on the leash. For the first time since the hearing began, she looked up. Directly at Elias. Winter slowly began to loosen its grip on Ashford. The snow melted in uneven patches along sidewalks and lawns. Pale sunlight started appearing between clouds that had ruled the sky for weeks. Inside Elias's house, small changes began happening too. Lila's backpack appeared on the hook beside the door. A pair of tiny sneakers showed up near the hallway rug. Crayon drawings began appearing on the refrigerator one by one. Stick figures, rainbows, a dog with enormous ears. The house that once felt like a museum slowly started feeling like a place someone lived. Healing came in strange ways. Some nights, Lila still woke suddenly checking the locks on the doors. Sometimes loud sounds made her flinch. Once she hid crackers in her backpack in case food disappeared. But there were new things too. She laughed more often now. Quiet at first, then louder. She began following Milo around the house like a shadow. The dog accepted the responsibility with patient dignity. One afternoon, Elias came home from work to find Lila sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by colored pencils. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She turned the paper around. 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, one dog, a crooked house beside them. Elias studied it carefully. Lila watched his face. Then she asked the question very carefully. "Do you think it looks like us?" Elias felt something warm and unexpected settle inside his chest. "Yes," he said softly. "I think it does." And for the first time since Ivy died, the house felt like a home again. Spring arrived quietly in Ashford, almost apologetically, as if the long winter had taken too much from the town to leave without hesitation. Patches of snow melted slowly into dark soil, and the first pale flowers began pushing through the cold ground beside sidewalks that had been silent for months. Inside Elias Thorne's house, the change was even more noticeable. The once perfectly ordered rooms now carried small signs of life everywhere. A pink backpack hung crookedly by the front door. Crayon drawings filled the refrigerator door. Milo's toys lay scattered across the living room rug like forgotten treasures. One quiet morning before school, Lila sat at the kitchen table reading a flyer her teacher had sent home. Elias stood at the stove making pancakes, pretending not to watch her struggle through the longer words. She traced each line carefully with her fingerlips, moving silently as she practiced reading aloud. When she reached the end, she paused for a long moment before speaking. "Families are invited," she read softly. The word families seemed to linger in the air between them. Lila looked up slowly, cheeks faintly pink with uncertainty. Elias turned slightly, sensing something important coming even before she spoke again. "Hey, Mr. Thorne?" she asked. He walked over and leaned against the counter. "Yeah," she hesitated, staring down at the paper in her hands, as if the answer might be written there somewhere. Finally, she took a breath and looked up at him. "Can I call you something else?" The question landed gently but with enormous weight. Elias felt his heart stumble in his chest. "What did you have in mind?" he asked softly. Lila bit her lip for a second before whispering the word she had clearly been afraid to say. "Maybe, Dad, just sometimes, if that's okay." For a moment, Elias couldn't speak. Then he knelt beside her chair so she didn't have to look up and said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like that very much." A few weeks later, on a cool afternoon, brushed with early spring wind, Elias drove Lila to the quiet hillside cemetery outside town. The sky above Ashford was pale silver, and the branches of the old maple trees whispered softly in the breeze. Lila held a small bundle of wildflowers in her hands, carefully wrapped in a piece of ribbon she had insisted on tying herself that morning. Elias carried another bouquet white lilies that trembled slightly as the wind moved across the hill. They walked slowly between the rows of headstones until Elias stopped in front of two that stood side by side. The names carved into the stone had once broken him completely, but today he felt something different as he looked down at them. Sadness was still there, but it was no longer the only thing. He placed the lilies gently at the base of the grave and stepped back to give Lila space. She approached carefully, as if she understood that this place mattered more than words could explain. After laying the wildflowers beside the lilies, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out something small. It was the faded purple hospital bracelet she had worn for weeks after leaving the hospital. The ink had nearly disappeared from it, but Elias recognized it immediately. Lila knelt and placed it beside the flowers. "I don't need this anymore," she whispered. For a moment she remained still, looking at the names on the stone as if speaking silently to someone she had never met. Then she added softly, "Thank you for sharing him with me." Elias closed his eyes, briefly overwhelmed by the quiet kindness in those words. When he opened them again, Lila was standing beside him with her small hand reaching for his. He took it gently, and together they walked back down the hill, leaving the bracelet behind as the wind moved softly through the trees. Late spring sunlight stretched across the quiet street where everything had begun. The same porch stood there beneath a pale blue sky, the wood now dry and warm instead of buried beneath snow. Elias stepped outside his house and looked down the street toward it, remembering the exact place where he had first seen Lila sitting curled against the railing, trying to make herself small enough that no one would notice her. For a long moment, he simply stood there, letting the memory pass through him without turning away from it. Inside the house behind him, laughter echoed faintly through the open door. Milo barked excitedly, followed by the quick patter of small footsteps across the hardwood floor. Lila's voice carried out into the afternoon air. "Dad, you said we could bake cookies today." The word still felt new every time he heard it, but it no longer hurt the way he once feared it would. Instead, it settled somewhere warm and steady inside his chest, like the quiet assurance that life had somehow found its way back into a place he once believed would remain empty forever. Elias glanced once more at the porch down the street. The place that had once held a freezing child and a decision that changed everything now looked ordinary again, just another part of the neighborhood. But he knew better. Sometimes the most important moments in a life arrive quietly disguised as small choices that seem easy to ignore. The difference between walking past and stopping can change the entire direction of two lives. He turned back toward the open door and stepped inside where warmth, laughter, and the smell of flour and sugar already filled the kitchen. Lila stood on a chair beside the counter, Milo watching attentively at her feet, And when she saw him, she grinned like the world had finally become a safe place to grow. And for the first time in years, Elias Thorne did not look back. Did this story move you? Share your thoughts in the comments and rate this story from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you don't miss other heartwarming stories. Click on the last screen to see the next emotional chapter waiting for you. See you in the next story.